A mobster used a racial slur on Bumpy Johnson. His 6-word response made the Mafia never return. The insult that froze Harlem, late 1940s. The evening air carried the smell of fried chicken from corner diners, mixed with the sweet smoke of cigars drifting through open windows. Inside a crowded restaurant on Lenox Avenue, the kind of place where jazz musicians ate after their sets and numbers runners collected their daily receipts, the Saturday night crowd was in full swing. The air was thick with cigarette smoke, loud conversation, and the clatter of dinner plates against worn tables. Then the door opened, and everything changed. 3 men in dark suits walked through the entrance. Expensive suits, tailored, the kind you didn't see often in Harlem, not on the shoulders of white men anyway. Italian. Their shoes were polished to a mirror shine, clicking deliberately against the linoleum floor as they moved through the crowd. Well-dressed, well-armed. The bulges under their jackets were impossible to miss for anyone who knew what to look for. And everyone in that room knew what to look for. The conversations didn't stop immediately. That would have been too obvious. But they quieted. Heads turned. Eyes tracked the 3 men as they moved deeper into the restaurant with the confidence of people who believed they owned every street they walked on, every room they entered. They were there for one man, Ellsworth Mayme Johnson. The man everyone in Harlem called Bumpy. He was sitting at a corner table, his back to the wall, the way he always sat. 2 associates flanked him. His dinner sat half-finished in front of him. He'd been in the middle of a conversation when the door opened. But now his attention was focused entirely on the 3 men approaching his table. The confrontation was public. That was the point. This wasn't a private meeting in some back room or warehouse. This was theater. A performance designed to send a message not just to Bumpy Johnson, but to everyone who considered him untouchable. The lead Italian mobster stopped at Bumpy's table. Words were exchanged. Low at first, the tone professional, almost polite. But the air in the restaurant had changed. People were watching now, pretending not to watch. Forks moved slower. Conversations dropped to whispers. Then the Italian's voice rose, just enough for nearby tables to hear. And then he said it. He looked Bumpy Johnson directly in the eye and used a racial slur, the N-word. Not whispered, not muttered. Loud enough for the entire room to hear. Loud enough that there could be no mistaking what had just happened. The restaurant went completely silent. Every fork stopped moving. Every conversation died mid-sentence. Even the kitchen seemed to go quiet. The only sound was the ceiling fan rotating overhead, cutting through the thick tension that had descended on the room like a weighted blanket. Every person in that room knew what should come next. They'd seen it before. They'd heard the stories. Disrespect like that, public humiliation delivered with that much intent, could only be answered one way: violence, blood, retaliation. This was Harlem in the 1940s. This was the Underworld. Respect wasn't a courtesy, it was currency. And what had just happened was the equivalent of someone walking into a bank and setting fire to the vault. People at nearby tables tensed, ready to dive for cover when the shooting started. Some hands moved toward hidden weapons. Bumpy's associates shifted in their seats, their eyes locked on their boss, waiting for the signal. But Bumpy Johnson didn't reach for a weapon. He didn't push back from the table. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't even stand up. His posture didn't change. His expression didn't harden. Instead, impossibly, he smiled. Not a nervous smile. Not a fake smile. A genuine, calm, almost amused smile. The kind of smile that suggested he knew something no one else in the room knew. The kind of smile that was somehow more terrifying than any gun he could have pulled. The Italian mobsters looked confused. They'd expected rage. They'd expected violence. They'd expected a response they could use as justification for what came next. Instead, they were looking at a man who appeared completely unbothered by what had just happened. And then Bumpy Johnson spoke. His voice was quiet, measured, calm. 6 words. So quiet that only the men at his table and the 3 Italian emissaries standing in front of him could hear them clearly. What Bumpy Johnson said next wasn't a threat. It wasn't a curse. It wasn't a promise of violence. It was a verdict, a statement of fact delivered with absolute certainty. Those 6 words would change how the Mafia dealt with Harlem forever. They would become legend. They would be retold in barbershops and pool halls and street corners for decades to come. But to understand why those 6 words carried the weight they did, why they were powerful enough to make armed men back down without a shot being fired, you need to understand who Bumpy Johnson really was and what he represented in a world where power was measured in blood and loyalty. If you want to hear stories about real power, real history, and the moments that changed the underworld forever, the stories that don't make it into textbooks, but shape the streets of American cities, make sure to hit that subscribe button. This is one story you won't find anywhere else. And it's just getting started. Who Bumpy Johnson really was, Ellsworth Raymond Johnson, was born on October 31st, 1905, in Charleston, South Carolina. He came into the world during one of the darkest periods in American history for black citizens. Jim Crow laws had cemented segregation throughout the South. Violence against black Americans was routine and often went unpunished. Economic opportunities were virtually non-existent. The promise of freedom after slavery had been systematically dismantled by white supremacist terrorism and discriminatory legislation. Young Ellsworth didn't have an easy childhood. He developed a habit of getting into fights, earning him the nickname that would stick with him for life: Bumpy. Some say it was because of a bump on the back of his head from an early injury. Others say it was his fighting style, the way he'd bump into opponents before throwing punches. When he was a teenager, Bumpy made a decision that millions of other black Southerners were making during the same period. He left. He joined the Great Migration, that massive movement of black Americans fleeing the Jim Crow South for the promise of something better in northern cities. He arrived in Harlem in the 1920s, during the neighborhood's cultural golden age. The Harlem Renaissance was in full swing. Jazz clubs lined the streets. Poets and writers gathered in cafes. Art and music and literature flourished. But alongside the cultural renaissance was a harder reality. Jobs were scarce. Housing was overcrowded. Legitimate economic opportunities for black residents were systematically limited by discrimination. What Harlem did have was an underground economy. And Bumpy Johnson, a young man with street smarts and a willingness to use violence when necessary, found his place in that economy quickly. By his early 20s, Bumpy had become an enforcer for Stephanie St. Clair, one of the most remarkable figures in Harlem's history. Stephanie, known as Madam Queen, was a black woman from the Caribbean who had built one of Harlem's most profitable numbers operations. In an era when women, particularly black women, had virtually no access to legitimate business opportunities, Stephanie St. Clair had created an empire. But empires need protection. Competitors don't respect boundaries unless those boundaries are enforced. And that's where Bumpy Johnson came in. Calling Bumpy Johnson just a gangster, just an enforcer, just a criminal, misses the point entirely. Yes, he committed crimes. Yes, he used violence. Yes, he operated outside the law. But he wasn't a street thug. He wasn't a mindless killer. He was a strategist, a negotiator. a power broker who understood something fundamental about authority that most people in his position never grasped. Fear can force compliance, but loyalty builds empires. Bumpy studied power the way other people studied law or medicine. He read constantly. Philosophy, history, strategy. He understood that lasting control didn't come from being the most violent person in the room. It came from being the most necessary person in the room. By the 1940s, Bumpy had risen from muscle to management. He wasn't just collecting debts and breaking legs anymore. He was making decisions, settling disputes, managing operations. He controlled significant portions of Harlem's numbers racket, the informal lottery system that had become central to the neighborhood's economy. He employed hundreds of people: runners, collectors, accountants, protection. He maintained order in a neighborhood that the New York Police Department had largely abandoned. When disputes arose between residents, they often went to Bumpy Johnson before they went to the police, because the police didn't care about problems in Harlem. But Bumpy did. And here's what made him different from almost every other criminal figure of his era. What made him more than just another gangster with a territory and a gun. Harlem accepted his authority. Not just because they were afraid of him, though many people were, but because in a deeply segregated America, where black communities were systematically excluded from legal economic opportunities, where banks wouldn't give loans and businesses wouldn't hire, and government programs didn't serve black neighborhoods the way they served white ones. Bumpy Johnson represented one of the few pathways to financial stability that actually existed. He ruled through relationships, not fear alone. He attended church on Sundays at the Abyssinian Baptist Church. He paid for funerals when families couldn't afford them. He made sure kids in the neighborhood had winter coats. He settled disputes between neighbors. He kept the peace. He functioned, in many ways, as an unofficial mayor of Harlem. To the Italian Mafia looking at Harlem from their headquarters in downtown Manhattan, from their social clubs in Little Italy and their restaurants in Midtown, Bumpy Johnson was just another black criminal running numbers in a black neighborhood. A gangster they'd eventually need to deal with or eliminate. To Harlem residents, he was something completely different. He was protection. He was employment. He was one of their own who had achieved power in a world designed to keep them powerless. He was proof that even in a system built to destroy black economic autonomy, a black man could build something that mattered. That's who was sitting at that table when the Italian mobsters walked in. That's who smiled when he should have been reaching for a gun. That's who spoke 6 words that would become legend. The numbers racket and why Harlem protected him. To understand why Bumpy Johnson had the power he did. Why the community would protect him, why his authority was so deeply rooted in Harlem's social fabric, you need to understand the numbers game. Because the numbers racket wasn't just gambling, it was infrastructure. The numbers game worked like this. Players would bet small amounts of money, sometimes as little as a penny, sometimes as much as $1, on a 3-digit number between Eros Rosero and 999. The winning number was determined by various methods, but most commonly, it was derived from the last 3 digits of the total betting handle at a specified racetrack, published in the daily newspapers. This made it virtually impossible to manipulate, which meant it was fair. Fairness mattered a lot. If your number hit, the payout was substantial, usually 600 to 1. Sometimes more depending on the operator. A dollar bet could turn into $600 overnight. In a neighborhood where the median annual income was maybe $1,000, where most people lived paycheck to paycheck when they had paychecks at all, where one unexpected expense could mean eviction or starvation, $600 was life-changing money. For Harlem residents living in overcrowded tenements, working jobs that paid starvation wages when they could find work at all. Shut out of the legitimate financial system by banks that wouldn't serve black customers and businesses that wouldn't hire black workers. The numbers game provided something that banks and legitimate businesses wouldn't provide: access to emergency cash. A dollar bet could turn into rent money, grocery money, medicine money, the difference between keeping your apartment and being on the street, the difference between eating and going hungry, the difference between getting your child the medical care they needed and watching them suffer. This wasn't entertainment gambling. This was survival gambling. Stephanie St. Clair built this system in Harlem in the 1920s and early 1930s. She was a genius at organization. She employed hundreds of runners who would collect bets from players throughout the day. She had collectors who would handle the money. She had accountants who would track everything. She paid out winners reliably and fairly. She kept the operation honest because honesty was what kept people betting. When a player hit their number, they got paid. Every time. No excuses, no delays, no intimidation. If Stephanie St. Clair's operation said you won, you won. And that reputation, that trustworthiness, was more valuable than any amount of muscle. But running an honest operation in the underworld was dangerous. Other criminals saw the profit Stephanie was generating and wanted a piece. In the early 1930s, Dutch Schultz, a violent Jewish gangster who controlled operations in the Bronx and Upper Manhattan, decided he wanted Harlem's numbers racket for himself. Dutch Schultz wasn't interested in maintaining community relationships or keeping the operation fair. He was interested in extraction, maximum profit, minimum payout, and he was willing to use extreme violence to get what he wanted. Stephanie St. Clair went to war, and she had Bumpy Johnson as her general, her primary enforcer, the man who would protect the operation and protect her. The war with Dutch Schultz was brutal. People died, buildings burned, but Stephanie and Bumpy held their ground. They understood something Dutch Schultz didn't. This wasn't just about who had more guns or who was more willing to kill. This was about who the community would accept. And Harlem wasn't going to accept an outsider, especially a white outsider, coming in and taking over an operation that had been built Boscan for the community. In 1935, Dutch Schultz was assassinated, not by Stephanie or Bumpy, but by the Italian Mafia, who had decided Dutch was too violent, too reckless, too much of a liability. His constant wars were attracting police attention. His lack of discipline was bad for business throughout the city. After Dutch Schultz's death, the numbers racket in Harlem stabilized. Stephanie gradually stepped back from day-to-day operations, and Bumpy Johnson took on a larger role. By the 1940s, he was the primary figure managing these operations throughout Harlem. And here's the critical point, the thing that made Bumpy Johnson different from every other gangster trying to run operations in black neighborhoods. The community saw him as one of their own. The money that came from the numbers racket stayed in Harlem. It employed Harlem residents. It supported Harlem businesses. It provided economic circulation in a neighborhood that had been systematically excluded from the mainstream economy. To outsiders, to police, to prosecutors, to the Italian Mafia looking in from downtown, it was crime. Just illegal gambling. Just another racket. To Harlem, it was survival. It was one of the only economic systems that actually worked for them in a city that had been designed to keep them poor and powerless. And that's the key to understanding what happened that night in the restaurant. Bumpy Johnson wasn't just protecting a criminal enterprise. He was protecting an economic lifeline for an entire community. He was protecting jobs. He was protecting a system that, however illegal, however imperfect, actually served the people who depended on it. And the community knew it, which meant they would protect him the same way he protected them. Bumpy and the Italian Mafia. The Italian Mafia, by the 1940s, was the dominant force in organized crime throughout New York City. Lucky Luciano had modernized the entire structure in the 1930s, transforming it from a collection of competing gangs into something more like a criminal corporation. Frank Costello, who took over after Luciano's deportation, was managing operations with business-like efficiency and ruthless effectiveness. They controlled everything. The docks, where every piece of cargo that moved through New York Harbor paid tribute. The garment district, where every dress manufacturer paid protection. The construction industry, where every building project required the right permits and the right cooperation. Labor unions, where every contract negotiation happened with mafia involvement. Gambling operations throughout the city. Loan sharking. Prostitution. Everything except Harlem. Harlem remained largely autonomous, and this bothered some people in the Italian Mafia. To them, it looked like weakness. It looked like they were allowing a black criminal to operate independently in the middle of their city. It looked like disrespect. But the smarter mafia leaders, particularly Frank Costello, understood the situation differently. They understood the math. Bumpy Johnson had working relationships with Italian mob figures. He knew Frank Costello personally. He had connections to Lucky Luciano before Luciano's deportation. He did business with various mafia crews when their interests aligned. But the relationship wasn't one of subordinate to boss. It wasn't Bumpy taking orders from the Italians. It was negotiated, transactional, built on mutual interest rather than domination. The Italians tolerated this arrangement, despite the objections of some of their more aggressive members, for three very practical reasons. First, Harlem was expensive to occupy. The neighborhood was densely populated, block after block of tenement buildings packed with people, narrow streets, tight-knit community. Everyone knew everyone else. Everyone was watching. Any Italian operation there would require constant enforcement, constant violence, constant attention. You couldn't just install some people and expect them to run things. The community wouldn't cooperate. And without cooperation, the numbers racket, which depended entirely on voluntary participation, would collapse. The police in Harlem, while certainly corrupt and certainly willing to take bribes, were also unpredictable. White police officers policing a black neighborhood were under constant scrutiny from black churches, black newspapers, black political organizations. Any sustained gang war in Harlem would create headlines that would force politicians to respond, which would force police to crack down, which would disrupt mafia operations not just in Harlem, but throughout the entire city. Second, violence in Harlem brought political heat that the mafia preferred to avoid. By the 1940s, Harlem had political representation. Adam Clayton Powell Jr. was making noise in Congress. Black churches had substantial influence over local politics. Black newspapers documented every crime, every police brutality incident, every example of discrimination. A gang war in Harlem would attract the kind of sustained attention that was bad for business everywhere. The mafia's power depended on operating in the shadows, on corrupting officials quietly, on maintaining relationships with politicians and police that allowed them to function without constant interference. A war in Harlem would turn spotlights on those relationships and make them impossible to maintain. Third, and this was the most important reason, the community would not cooperate with Italian control. This wasn't speculation. This was demonstrated fact, proven during Dutch Schultz's attempt to take over in the 1930s. Italian mobsters running numbers in Harlem would face a wall of silence and non-participation. No one would place bets with Italian operators. No one would pay debts. No one would provide information. No one would cooperate in any way. The operation would collapse not from violence, but from economic non-participation. You can force people to pay protection money. You can force businesses to give you a percentage, but you can't force people to gamble with you. If they don't want to play your numbers game, they just don't play. And without players, there's no money. The whole operation becomes worthless. Bumpy Johnson understood all of this. So did Frank Costello. And so an understanding existed. Harlem would remain largely autonomous as long as it didn't interfere with Italian operations elsewhere in the city, as long as it didn't create problems that affected the broader criminal ecosystem. It was a practical arrangement, not based on respect or friendship, but based on cold calculation about costs and benefits, about what was worth fighting for and what wasn't. But not everyone in the Mafia accepted this arrangement. Some of the younger, more aggressive members saw it as weakness. They saw Harlem as untapped territory, as money being left on the table. They believed that respect without the willingness to enforce it through violence was meaningless. They believed that allowing a black man to operate independently, to refuse Mafia control, set a dangerous precedent. And one night, someone decided to test that theory. Someone decided to challenge Bumpy Johnson publicly, to force a confrontation that would either establish Italian dominance or expose Bumpy as powerless. That decision would prove to be a serious miscalculation. The confrontation. According to Harlem legend and Underworld accounts that have been passed down through decades, verified by multiple sources but never officially documented, the confrontation happened in a public space. The exact location varies depending on who's telling the story. Some say it was a restaurant on Lenox Avenue. Others say a club on 125th Street. Some versions place it in the late 1940s. Others in the early 1950s. The details shift in the retelling, the way all legendary stories do. But what remains consistent across every version is the intent behind the confrontation and what happened as a result. An Italian emissary, backed by armed associates, entered the establishment looking for Bumpy Johnson. This wasn't a private meeting scheduled in advance. This wasn't a quiet sit-down in some neutral location. This was a public demonstration, a message delivered in front of witnesses, theater designed to humiliate. The emissary and his associates moved through the space with deliberate aggression. They weren't trying to be subtle. They wanted everyone to see them. They wanted everyone to know who they represented and why they were there. They approached Bumpy's table. He was eating dinner, conducting business, doing what he did every evening. Surrounded by his associates, relaxed, comfortable, in his territory. The Italian emissary stood at the table. Words were exchanged. The tone was professional at first, almost polite. But everyone watching could feel the tension building. This wasn't a friendly conversation. This was a test. The discussion escalated. The Italian's voice rose slightly, just enough for nearby tables to hear. He was making demands, asserting authority, trying to establish dominance, treating Bumpy Johnson like a subordinate who needed to be reminded of his place. And then, deliberately, calculatedly, publicly, the Italian mobster used a racial slur, the N-word, directed at Bumpy Johnson, loud enough for everyone in the immediate area to hear, clear enough that there could be no mistaking what had just been said. It was the ultimate insult, not just disrespectful, not just offensive. It was designed to be unforgivable. It was designed to force Bumpy into a corner where he had only two choices: respond with violence or lose all credibility. The Italian mobsters had calculated this carefully. If Bumpy responded with violence, they had justification for what came next. They could claim self-defense. They could bring in more soldiers. They could escalate the situation into a full gang war and justify it by saying Bumpy had attacked first. If Bumpy didn't respond with violence, if he let the insult stand, he would look weak. His authority would be questioned. His reputation would be damaged. Other criminals would see an opportunity. His own people might start to wonder if he still had the strength to protect them. It was a trap, carefully constructed, seemingly inescapable. Everyone in that room understood the stakes. The conversations had stopped completely now. Everyone was watching. Some people were preparing to dive for cover when the shooting started. Others were calculating escape routes. A few hands moved toward hidden weapons. Bumpy's associates were locked on their boss, waiting for the signal, ready to pull guns, ready to turn the restaurant into a war zone, ready to die if that's what the moment required. But Bumpy Johnson didn't reach for a weapon. He didn't push his chair back. He didn't stand up. He didn't raise his voice. His posture didn't change. His expression didn't harden into rage. He sat perfectly still, completely calm. And then he smiled. Not a nervous smile. Not a fake smile meant to hide fear. Not a threatening smile meant to intimidate. A genuine, calm, almost amused smile. The kind of smile that suggested he found the entire situation entertaining rather than threatening. The kind of smile that was somehow more unsettling than any display of anger could have been. In the underworld, among men who had spent their entire lives reading threats and calculating danger, that smile communicated something important. Bumpy Johnson was not afraid. He was not threatened. He was not concerned. The Italian mobsters looked confused now. They had expected rage. They had expected violence. They had expected a response they could use as justification for escalation. Instead, they were looking at a man who appeared completely unbothered by what had just happened. A man who seemed to be in complete control of the situation, despite being outnumbered and publicly insulted. The silence stretched out. Seconds that felt like minutes. Everyone waiting to see what would happen next. And then Bumpy Johnson spoke. His voice was quiet, measured, calm, almost conversational. 6 words, spoken so quietly that only the men at his immediate table and the 3 Italian emissaries standing in front of him could hear them clearly. But those 6 words, delivered in that quiet voice with that calm smile, would be remembered and retold for decades. The 6-word response. The exact 6 words Bumpy Johnson spoke that night vary depending on which account you hear. This is important to understand. There's no recording. There's no transcript. There's no official record. No one wrote down exactly what was said in the moment it was said. What we have are retellings. Stories passed down through decades. Accounts from people who were there, or who heard from people who were there, or who heard from people who heard from people who were there. The way all oral history works, especially oral history from the criminal underworld where people don't typically document their activities in writing. Some versions of the story offer one specific phrasing. Other versions offer different phrasing. The exact words shift in the retelling. But what remains absolutely consistent across every version, what every account agrees on, is the meaning behind those words. Bumpy Johnson told the Italian mobsters something that made them understand a fundamental truth about power in Harlem. Something that made them understand why controlling Harlem wasn't just difficult, it was impossible. Something that made them understand that the person in danger in that moment wasn't Bumpy Johnson, it was them. The message, distilled and synthesized across multiple retellings over decades, communicated this essential truth. Your people will turn on you before mine ever do. 6 words. or some variation of those 6 words. The exact phrasing less important than the meaning they conveyed. It wasn't a threat of violence. Bumpy wasn't saying he would kill them. He wasn't promising retaliation. He wasn't threatening to bring his own soldiers to war. It wasn't a curse or an insult thrown back at them. He wasn't meeting their disrespect with more disrespect. It was a statement of social and political reality. A simple fact about how power worked in Harlem versus how power worked in the Italian Mafia. An explanation of why the math didn't work in their favor. What Bumpy was saying, what those 6 words communicated with perfect clarity, was this: if you kill me, Harlem doesn't become easier to control. It becomes impossible. If you kill me, the community doesn't submit out of fear. It resists out of anger. Every person in this neighborhood who bets numbers, who relies on this economic system for survival, who sees me as one of their own, will refuse to cooperate with you. The operation you're trying to take over will collapse the moment you take it. And when your superiors in the Mafia, the men who actually understand business, the men who care about profit and stability rather than pride and reputation, when Frank Costello and the other bosses realize that you've started a war in Harlem that can't be won, that's disrupting business operations across the entire city, that's bringing police attention and political pressure and federal investigators, they won't blame Harlem. They won't blame me. They'll blame you. You think you're representing power right now, standing here with your guns and your insults and your threats. But you're actually alone. You're in a room full of people who are loyal to me, not because I threaten them or hurt them or force them to submit, but because I'm part of them. Because I'm theirs. Your organization values hierarchy and discipline. You follow orders from above. You respect the chain of command. Your bosses value profit over everything else. And when you report back that you've started a war in Harlem that's costing money and attracting attention and can't be won, they will question your judgment. They will question your value. They will wonder if you're a liability. My organization, if you can even call it that, values community and survival. The people who work with me, who support me, who protect me, they do it because our interests are aligned. Because I succeed when they succeed. Because I'm theirs and they're mine. You can kill me. That's true. You have guns. You have the ability to commit violence. But you can't kill what I represent. You can't kill the relationships I've built. You can't kill the trust I've earned. You can't kill the economic ecosystem that depends on this operation being run fairly and honestly. And the moment you try, the moment you pull that trigger, your own people will turn on you for starting a war they can't win and don't want to fight. This was not bravado. This was not confidence born from having more guns or more soldiers. This was arithmetic, cold calculation. A simple explanation of why the confrontation they had started couldn't end the way they wanted it to end. Bumpy Johnson had just explained to them, in 6 words, why they had already lost. Why the Mafia backed off, the Italian mobsters left the restaurant that night without further incident. No shots fired, no punches thrown, no violence, no escalation. They simply turned and walked out. Back through the restaurant. Out the door. Into the Harlem night. The people who witnessed it couldn't quite believe what they'd seen. They'd expected violence. They'd braced for it. And instead, they'd watched armed Italian mobsters back down from a confrontation with Bumpy Johnson without him ever raising his voice or reaching for a weapon. The story spread through Harlem within hours. By the next day, everyone knew. Within a week, it had reached other boroughs. Within a month, it was part of Underworld legend. But why did they back off? Why did those armed men, representing one of the most powerful criminal organizations in American history, walk away from that confrontation. Because Bumpy Johnson had made them understand the math. And once they understood the math, continuing the confrontation made no sense. Harlem was densely populated. Over 200,000 people living in less than 3 square miles. Blocks packed with tenement buildings, narrow streets, tight spaces. Any gang war there would be loud, visible, impossible to contain. Bullets don't stop at property lines. Violence in a neighborhood that crowded would inevitably affect innocent people, which would bring attention, which would force responses. The New York City Police Department, for all their corruption and all their racism, would be forced to respond to sustained gang violence in Harlem. Not because they cared about Harlem residents, but because politicians would force them to respond. Because black churches would demand action. Because black newspapers would document every shooting and every death and put pressure on City Hall. And police crackdowns in Harlem would inevitably spread to other neighborhoods. Cops who were actively working cases in Harlem might pay more attention to other areas. Federal investigators who got involved might start looking at other operations. A war in Harlem could destabilize the entire criminal ecosystem throughout New York City. Then there was the political reality. By the late 1940s, Harlem had real political power. Adam Clayton Powell Jr. was in Congress. Black churches had influence. Black voters were becoming organized. Politicians who wanted black votes had to at least pretend to care about what happened in black neighborhoods. Sustained mob violence in Harlem would force politicians to respond. It would bring federal attention. It would create problems that extended far beyond one neighborhood. And then there was the economic reality, the math that Bumpy had explained in 6 words. Without community cooperation, the numbers racket in Harlem was worthless. Italian mobsters couldn't collect bets from people who refused to place them. They couldn't enforce debts in a community that wouldn't cooperate. They couldn't run an operation that depended entirely on voluntary participation if people chose not to participate. They could occupy the territory. They could set up operations. They could install their people. But if Harlem residents simply refused to play numbers with Italian operators, if they boycotted the operation the way they'd boycotted Dutch Schultz's operation in the 1930s, the whole enterprise would generate 0 revenue while costing substantial amounts to maintain and defend. Frank Costello, the most powerful mob boss in New York at the time, understood this immediately when it was reported to him. Costello wasn't a hot-headed gangster who acted on emotion. He was a businessman who happened to operate outside the law. He understood that profit over pride wasn't just a philosophy. It was practical. Costello had seen what happened when Dutch Schultz tried to take Harlem by force. He'd seen the costs. He'd seen the problems it created. He'd ultimately authorized Dutch's assassination because Dutch's constant wars were bad for business. Bumpy Johnson had just demonstrated that forcing Harlem into submission would cost more than it could ever be worth. That the economic value of controlling Harlem was less than the cost of actually controlling it. That respect earned through negotiation was more valuable than submission extracted through violence. Power that requires constant force to maintain is already weak. It's fragile. It's expensive. It creates resentment that eventually explodes into resistance. Power built on mutual interest, on relationships, on being necessary rather than threatening. That kind of power is durable. It maintains itself. It doesn't require constant enforcement. The Italian Mafia made a business decision that night. They decided that cooperation with Bumpy Johnson was more profitable than conflict. That maintaining the existing arrangement was smarter than trying to change it by force. It wasn't sentiment. It wasn't respect in any emotional sense. It was cold calculation. The same kind of calculation that had made the Mafia successful in the first place. What changed after that night? In the years following that confrontation, the historical record shows something significant. The Italian Mafia never attempted a full-scale takeover of Harlem's numbers operations. This is documented fact, verifiable through newspaper accounts, police records, and the testimony of people who were active in both communities during that era. The relationship between Bumpy Johnson and the Italian Mafia shifted. It became more formalized, more respectful, more structured around mutual benefit rather than the constant testing and posturing that had characterized it before. When deals needed to be made, they were negotiated. When territories needed to be defined, they were agreed upon through conversation rather than violence. When coordination was needed between Harlem operations and downtown operations, it happened through established channels with Bumpy Johnson as the primary representative of Harlem interests. This wasn't because the Mafia suddenly developed a moral conscience. It wasn't because they decided racial equality was important. It was because Bumpy Johnson had made the business case crystal clear. Cooperation was profitable, and conquest was expensive. The numbers racket in Harlem remained black-controlled throughout the 1940s and 1950s. The profits stayed largely in the community. The employment stayed in the community. The economic circulation that had developed around the numbers game continued operating without Italian interference. Italian mobsters still operated in Harlem. They had their interests there. They had relationships with various operators. But they operated as partners or service providers, not as overlords. They didn't try to take over. They didn't try to force submission. They recognized that Bumpy Johnson's authority in Harlem was real, based on community support that couldn't be displaced by violence. Bumpy's authority in Harlem became unquestioned after that night. Not just by the community, which had always supported him, but by the Mafia as well. When other Italian crews considered making moves in Harlem, they were told by their own leadership to clear it with Bumpy first, to negotiate, to make deals rather than demands. This represented something almost unprecedented in the American underworld at that time. A black criminal operator maintaining genuine autonomy in a major city, dealing with the Italian Mafia as an equal rather than a subordinate. There were other black numbers operators in other cities. There were other black criminals who achieved success and power. But very few maintained the kind of territorial control and negotiating position that Bumpy Johnson maintained in Harlem. And the reason he could maintain it was the same reason those Italian mobsters backed down that night. His power wasn't based on violence alone. It was based on community support that made him genuinely untouchable. The story of that confrontation spread throughout the underworld. It became legend. Other criminals studied it, tried to understand how Bumpy had done what he'd done, how he'd faced down armed Italian mobsters with nothing but words. But most of them missed the point. They thought it was about what Bumpy said. They thought those 6 words were some kind of magic spell, some perfect phrase that had special power. The 6 words didn't have power by themselves. They had power because of everything behind them: the community relationships, the economic infrastructure, the years of building trust and loyalty, the understanding of how power actually works when it's not built on fear alone. Anyone could have said those words, but only Bumpy Johnson could have made them mean something, because only Bumpy Johnson had built what he'd built in Harlem. That's what changed after that night. It wasn't just that the Mafia backed off from one confrontation. It was that the entire criminal power structure in New York City had to acknowledge that Harlem was different. that the normal rules didn't apply there, that Bumpy Johnson represented something that couldn't be conquered or controlled through traditional means. And for Black Harlem, living under segregation, living under systematic discrimination, living in a country that had been designed to keep them powerless, that meant something significant. It meant that in at least one sphere, in at least one domain, they had real power that even the most powerful white criminal organization in America had to respect. The deeper meaning of the story. This story, whether it unfolded exactly as legend describes or represents a distillation of multiple interactions over time, carries lessons about the nature of power that extend far beyond organized crime in 1940s Harlem. Bumpy Johnson understood something fundamental that most people in positions of authority never grasp: the difference between power and force. Force is simple. Force is obvious. Force is a gun pressed against someone's head, a threat delivered, violence promised or carried out. Force can compel immediate compliance. It can make people do what you want in the moment. But force is also fragile. Force requires constant maintenance. The moment you're not watching, the moment your attention is elsewhere, the moment your back is turned, people will resist. Force creates resentment. And resentment, given enough time, given enough pressure, will explode into rebellion. Power is different. Real power, lasting power, sustainable power, that comes from being necessary. From being wanted, not just feared. From having people choose to support you because your success is tied to their success. From building systems where everyone has an investment in maintaining your authority, because maintaining your authority maintains the benefits they receive. The Italian mobster who insulted Bumpy that night believed power came from the barrel of a gun and the willingness to use it. He believed that respect without the threat of violence was meaningless. He believed that anyone who didn't respond to insults with immediate violence was weak. He was wrong about all of it. Bumpy didn't need to respond with rage, because rage would have proven that he felt threatened. Restraint demonstrated that he wasn't threatened. Calm demonstrated control. The smile demonstrated confidence. The 6 words demonstrated understanding. Understanding of what? Understanding that power doesn't come from being the scariest person in the room. It comes from being the most necessary person in the room. Understanding that authority based on fear is temporary, but authority based on mutual interest can last generations. Anyone can pull a gun. Anyone can make threats. Anyone can commit violence. These things require no special skill, no particular intelligence, no sophisticated understanding of human nature or social dynamics. They're the tools of the desperate and the unimaginative. But commanding a room without threatening anyone, ending a confrontation without raising your voice, making armed men back down through nothing but words and the weight of community support behind those words, that requires something different. That requires actual power. The Italian mobsters who left that restaurant that night didn't leave because they were afraid of Bumpy Johnson personally. They didn't leave because they thought he would shoot them. They left because they understood the system he represented was stronger, more durable, more sustainable than the system they represented. In a world built on hierarchy and force, where most criminal organizations operated through fear and intimidation and constant violence, Bumpy Johnson had created something different in Harlem. He'd created a network of mutual dependency where his survival was tied to the community's prosperity, and the community's prosperity was tied to his protection. That's not typical crime. That's not how most criminal organizations operate. Most criminal organizations are extractive. They take from communities. They exploit. They destroy. They create nothing. They only consume. What Bumpy Johnson built in Harlem was different. It was still illegal. It was still outside the law. It still involved violence and crime. But it also provided employment, economic circulation, financial access, dispute resolution, and a form of community governance in a neighborhood that had been systematically abandoned by legal institutions. Was it ideal? No. Was it just? Debatable. Was it better than the alternatives available to Harlem residents at that time? Many people who lived through that era would say yes. The deeper meaning of this story isn't about glorifying crime. It's about understanding how power actually works, how authority is built and maintained, how respect is earned rather than forced, how community relationships create durability that violence alone can never achieve. In every sphere of life, whether it's politics or business or community organization or leadership of any kind, these same principles apply. The leaders who last, who build something sustainable, who create systems that outlive them, they're the ones who understand that loyalty is more valuable than fear, that being necessary is more powerful than being threatening, that respect earned through relationships is more durable than respect extracted through force. Bumpy Johnson, a criminal operating in an illegal enterprise in a segregated neighborhood in 1940s America, understood this better than most legitimate leaders ever do. That's the lesson. That's what makes this story worth remembering and retelling. Legacy and closing reflection. Bumpy Johnson died on July 7th, 1968. He was 62 years old. He collapsed in a restaurant in Harlem, appropriately enough, surrounded by people who knew his name and his legend. He'd had a heart attack. He was pronounced dead shortly after arrival at the hospital. His funeral was attended by hundreds of people. Some sources say thousands. They came from all over Harlem. Some came from other boroughs. Some came from other cities. They came to pay respects to a man who, despite being a criminal by every legal definition, represented something important in their community. Protection, power, proof that even in a system designed to keep Black Americans powerless, one black man had built something that mattered. The numbers racket in Harlem continued after his death, though it gradually declined as state-run lotteries became legal and absorbed the economic function that the illegal numbers game had served. The community relationships he'd built, the networks of loyalty and mutual support, those dissipated over time, as they always do when the central figure is gone. But his legend grew. Books have been written about him. Multiple books. Documentaries have been made. Television shows have dramatized his life, sometimes accurately, often not. Filmmakers have tried to capture his story with varying degrees of success. His life remains debated. Historians argue about his methods, his impact, his legacy. Was he a criminal who exploited his community? Or a community leader who provided necessary services? Was he a gangster who happened to be black? Or a black man who turned to crime because legal economic opportunities were systematically denied to him? Was he a predator or a protector? The answer, like most historical answers about complicated people, is probably all of the above. He was a criminal. He committed crimes. He used violence. He operated outside the law. These things are documented and undeniable. But he was also, within the context of his time and place, a community leader who provided economic infrastructure, dispute resolution, and a form of governance in a neighborhood that had been abandoned by legal institutions. He protected Harlem's economic autonomy from outside takeover. He maintained systems that, however illegal, actually served community needs. What's undeniable, what even his critics acknowledge, is this. In an era of segregation, systematic discrimination, and deliberate economic exclusion, Bumpy Johnson represented a rare form of power in Black America. He built authority in a community that had been denied access to legitimate authority. He created economic opportunity in a neighborhood where legal economic opportunity was scarce. He achieved a level of autonomy and respect from white power structures, both legal and illegal, that very few Black Americans of his era achieved in any domain. He did this through violence, yes, but also through intelligence, through negotiation, through an understanding of community dynamics and power relationships that most criminals never develop and most legitimate leaders never understand. The story of that night in the restaurant, the 6 words that made the Mafia back down. Whether it happened exactly as the legend describes or represents something more symbolic, captures something essential about Bumpy Johnson's approach to power. He understood that force is temporary, but necessity is lasting. He understood that fear can compel, but loyalty sustains. He understood that the most dangerous weapon isn't the one you carry in your hand, but the relationships you've built in your community. The most dangerous weapon Bumpy Johnson ever carried wasn't steel or lead. It was loyalty. The loyalty of a community that saw him as one of their own. The loyalty that made him untouchable, not because he was violent, but because removing him would destabilize an entire economic and social ecosystem that people depended on for survival. That's the real story, not the 6 words themselves, which may have varied or may never have been spoken exactly as legend describes them. But what made those words, whatever they were, powerful enough to stop armed men without a shot being fired? It was everything behind them. The years of community building, the economic infrastructure, the trust earned through fairness and reliability, the understanding that Bumpy Johnson represented something larger than himself. And attacking him meant attacking a system that would fight back, not with violence alone, but with complete non-cooperation. Before you go, I want to ask you something. Have you ever witnessed a moment where calm authority changed the outcome of a situation that could have turned violent? Where restraint demonstrated more power than aggression? Where words carried more weight than weapons? Where someone in a position of weakness, at least apparent weakness, turned the situation around through understanding the deeper dynamics of power? These moments happen more often than you might think. In business negotiations, in political confrontations, in street situations, in family conflicts, anywhere people are competing for authority or respect or control. The people who succeed in these moments, who turn potentially violent confrontations into resolved situations, they're usually the people who understand what Bumpy Johnson understood. That real power comes from being necessary, not just being scary. That lasting authority comes from relationships, not just from force. Drop your thoughts in the comments. Share your own experiences or observations. And if you want more stories about real history, about the moments that changed everything, about the people who understood power better than anyone else, about the lessons from history that still apply today, make sure to subscribe. Hit that notification bell so you don't miss the next story. Because history, real history, the kind that doesn't make it into textbooks but shape the world we live in, that history is full of lessons about power and authority and human nature that are just as relevant today as they were in 1940s Harlem. This is just the beginning. There are more stories to tell, more lessons to learn, more history to explore. Subscribe and join us for the next one.